She'll never leave me," the Duke told his mistress. Then he turned around and found her gone. A True Story, England, 1887. Edmund Hartwell, the 5th Duke of Ashbourne, was a man who believed in certainty. He believed in the certainty of his land, the certainty of his wealth, and, above all things, the certainty of his wife. Lady Cecilia Hartwell had stood beside him for 8 years. She had sat at the far end of his long dining table, smiled at his guests, managed his household, raised his sons, and asked very little in return. In Edmund's mind, this was simply the order of things. It had always been this way. It would always be this way. He never stopped to examine why he believed this. He simply did. It was a cold February evening in 1887 when Edmund said those words aloud for the first time. He was sitting in the warm sitting room of a house in Mayfair, a house he paid for quietly, without discussion, across from a woman named Dorothea Vale. She was a widow, sharp-minded and composed, and she had been Edmund's companion for nearly 3 years. The fire was low. The wine was good. Dorothea had made some passing remark about Cecilia, something light, something curious, and Edmund had laughed softly and waved his hand in the air as if brushing away a fly. "She'll never leave me," he said. He said it easily, without thinking, the way a man states a fact he has never once had reason to question. "She hasn't the first idea how." Dorothea looked at him for a moment. She said nothing. She lifted her glass and looked at the fire instead, and Edmund, comfortable in his certainty, did not notice the silence that followed. Cecilia Hartwell had grown up as Cecilia Ashford, the eldest daughter of a well-respected London barrister named George Ashford. Her father was a thoughtful man who believed, quietly but firmly, that intelligence had no gender. He had taught Cecilia to read at 4 years old. By the time she was 10, she was reading his legal texts for entertainment. By 15, she could follow the argument of a courtroom case better than most of his junior colleagues. She had a memory that held things precisely and a mind that arranged them neatly. She was, in every practical sense, her father's daughter. When she married Edmund at 23, she did not do so out of love, exactly. She did so because it was the path her world offered her. A woman of her position married well. She managed a household. She raised children. She endured. These were not her own words, they were the architecture of the world she had been born into, and she had stepped into that architecture as one steps through a door that everyone else is already walking through. But Cecilia had never stopped thinking. And she had never stopped watching. In the first year of her marriage, she noticed that Edmund handled all financial matters himself and shared nothing with her. She said nothing. In the second year, she noticed that the household accounts she was given to manage were a small, controlled portion of the estate's actual finances. She said nothing. In the third year, she began to read, carefully, quietly, late in the evenings, about the legal status of married women in England. What she found was not surprising. It was simply confirmed. A married woman, under the law of that time, owned almost nothing in her own name. Her property became her husband's at the moment of marriage. Her earnings, if she had any, were his. Her decisions required his agreement. She was, legally speaking, joined to him in a way that left very little room for herself. Cecilia read all of this with the same calm attention she had always given to difficult texts. She took no dramatic positions. She drew no tearful conclusions. She simply understood her situation with great precision, and then she began to think about what she could do within it. The answer came slowly, over many years, and it came in the form of 3 people. The first was Mr. Arthur Fenwick, a solicitor who had worked alongside her father for many years. Cecilia had known him since childhood. He was a careful, principled man with a great deal of quiet courage, and when Cecilia began writing him letters, carefully worded, entirely proper letters, asking specific legal questions about inheritance, property rights, and the legal procedures available to a married woman, he answered every one of them. He understood what she was asking without her ever needing to say it directly. He began, in his own quiet way, to prepare. The second was Mrs. Harriet Colm, a woman Cecilia had met through a charitable organization in London 3 years into her marriage. Harriet ran a modest residential house for women in Edinburgh, a practical, warm place that asked no difficult questions of the women who arrived at its door. She and Cecilia had written to each other for years, and in those letters, a friendship had grown that was nothing like the polished, surface-level friendships of drawing rooms. Harriet knew things about Cecilia that Edmund had never bothered to ask. The third was Annie. Annie had been Cecilia's lady's maid for 5 years. She was 24 years old, practical, loyal, and entirely clear-eyed about the household she worked in. Cecilia had never treated Annie as furniture, and Annie, in return, had never treated Cecilia as a burden. Between them had grown a trust that was simple and unspoken and completely solid. For 3 years, Cecilia had been preparing. She did not think of it dramatically. She thought of it the way her father had taught her to think about a long legal case, one careful step at a time, each piece placed properly before the next one was moved. She wrote letters. She asked questions. She waited for answers. She made small decisions that, by themselves, meant nothing, but together added up to something real. She learned, for example, exactly what her father had left her when he died, a modest inheritance that had passed, as the law required, into Edmund's management. She learned the specific legal language that governed such arrangements. She learned what could be contested, and what could not, and what Mr. Fenwick believed could be recovered through the right process. She learned all of this with the calm attention of a woman reading a map, not with passion, but with purpose. Annie, meanwhile, was packing. Not quickly, and not obviously. A dress here, carefully folded and placed in a traveling case kept at the back of a wardrobe. A pair of boots there. A winter coat. A few books. Small things, moved slowly, over many months, until 2 cases were full and sitting ready behind a closed door, and no one in the household had noticed anything at all. The actual breaking point arrived on an ordinary morning in February, the same month, as it happened, that Edmund was having his warm conversation in Mayfair. Cecilia had gone into Edmund's study to leave a letter on his desk, as she occasionally did, and she had noticed, sitting open beside the inkwell, a document from the estate's solicitor. She read it the way she always read things, quickly, completely, and with full understanding. It was a proposal to consolidate certain financial arrangements of the household. Buried within its careful legal language was a mechanism that would place Cecilia's personal inheritance, the money left to her by her father, the last thing that was in any meaningful sense hers, under the full administrative control of the estate. It was not, technically, illegal. It was the kind of thing that happened quietly, in paperwork, without discussion. Edmund had likely signed it without giving it much thought. He probably assumed she did not know it existed. She stood in the study for a long moment. Then she set the letter back exactly as she had found it. She straightened her dress. She walked out, closed the door behind her, and went to find Annie. "It is time," she said. Annie nodded as if she had been expecting those exact words, which, in truth, she had. That evening, Cecilia sat at dinner with Edmund as she had done for 8 years. She asked how his day had been. He was vague, as he usually was, mentioning a meeting and a club dinner and something about the stables. She told him the boys had done well in their lessons that week. He nodded with the pleasant half-attention he gave most things she said. She served herself from the dish in front of her, ate with good posture, and smiled when a smile was appropriate. She was, as always, perfect. She went to bed at her usual time. She said good night to Edmund in the hallway. He was already thinking of something else. At 3 o'clock in the morning, she got up. Annie was already dressed and waiting near the servants' entrance. The 2 traveling cases were there. A hired carriage, arranged by Mr. Fenwick's office the week before, was waiting a short distance from the house, far enough not to disturb the staff. Cecilia was dressed plainly. She wore no jewelry except her father's watch, which had been hers before the marriage and had simply never been discussed. She carried nothing that belonged to Edmund Hartwell. She left one letter on the dining room table, placed where it would be found in the morning. It was written on her usual paper, in her usual hand, calm, clear, perfectly spaced. It was not an emotional letter. It did not explain her feelings or rehearse her grievances. It was a precise legal document, written in language she had learned over years of careful reading. It referenced the inheritance arrangement she had found, cited the relevant statutes by name, and informed the Duke that she would be working with Mr. Arthur Fenwick to pursue a formal separation. It noted, plainly, that she had already left. She signed it, Cecilia Ashford Hartwell. The use of her maiden name first, restored before her married name, was entirely deliberate. It was the first line of a signature she would use for the rest of her life. By the time the sun came up over Ashbourne Manor, Cecilia and Annie were already on a northbound train. The English countryside moved past the window, grey and quiet in the early morning light. Annie fell asleep against the seat. Cecilia sat straight-backed and still, watching the fields pass, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. Edmund discovered her absence at 9 o'clock in the morning. His housekeeper came to him with a pale face and a quiet voice and told him that Lady Ashbourne had not rung for breakfast, and that when she had gone to check, the room was empty. Edmund went to look himself. The wardrobe was full, the gowns, the pearls, the formal things were all still there. She had taken nothing of his, nothing that represented her role as the Duchess of Ashbourne. She had taken only what had already been hers. He found the letter on the dining table. He read it once, quickly, and then he sat down and read it again, slowly. He read it a third time and understood that it was written by a woman who had been planning this for a very long time. The legal references were precise. The language was clear. There was no crack in it, no emotion he could hold onto, no weakness he could approach. It was, he realized with a feeling he had not expected, a better document than most of the paperwork that crossed his own desk. He sent for his solicitor. Then, later that afternoon, in a moment that surprised even himself, he went to Dorothea's house in Mayfair. She received him in her sitting room, the same room where, not 2 weeks before, he had laughed and said those easy words. He told her what had happened, still half in disbelief, still carrying some expectation that she would confirm what he had always believed, that this was impossible, that Cecilia could not really have done this, that there had been some misunderstanding. Dorothea listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, but was very clear. "You told me she would never leave," she said. She picked up her teacup and held it in both hands. "It appears you were wrong." Edmund had no answer for that. He sat in the chair across from her and said nothing for a long time, and the fire crackled quietly between them, and outside the window London went on without caring at all. Cecilia arrived in Edinburgh on a grey afternoon and was met at the door of Harriet Colm's residential house by Harriet herself, who shook her hand firmly and said, "You're here. Good. Come in out of the cold." It was not a dramatic welcome. It was not meant to be. It was practical and warm and exactly what Cecilia needed. The months that followed were not easy. Freedom, for a woman in 1887, was not a simple thing. There was a great deal of gossip among those who knew her. There were social consequences, invitations that stopped coming, acquaintances who crossed the street rather than speak to her, letters that were suddenly never answered. The world she had grown up in had not been designed for women who made choices like this, and it let her know so in 100 small, cold ways. But Cecilia had built something that held. Mr. Fenwick worked through the legal process with patience and precision, and the matter of the inheritance was eventually resolved in her favor. The specific arrangement Edmund had signed had not yet been completed, and enough of the original documentation existed to contest it properly. It was not a victory that made news. It was a quiet victory, handled in offices and letters, exactly the way Cecilia had planned. She taught reading at Harriet's house, working with women who arrived there from all kinds of different circumstances. She found, in that work, something that felt genuinely useful. She began writing as well, first short pieces, careful and modest, about the legal circumstances of women in England. She published them under a pen name. Then, gradually, under her own. She lived simply. She was not rich, but she was not desperate. She had enough, and she had herself, which was more than she had expected when she had stood in Edmund's study and read that letter by the inkwell. Her sons grew up between two worlds. They spent time at Ashbourne Manor with their father, and they came to Edinburgh to see their mother. The elder boy, William, came to her one afternoon when he was 17 and sat across from her at her small writing desk and told her that he had read some of her published work. He told her he thought it was very good. He said he was proud of her. Cecilia looked at her son for a long moment. Then she thanked him simply, and asked if he would like tea. Edmund never remarried. He lived at Ashbourne Manor for the rest of his life, managing his land and attending his clubs and filling his long dining table with guests. Dorothea eventually moved to Paris, where she built a life that suited her well. The manor remained large and expensive and, by most accounts, quiet. What Edmund had said in that warm sitting room in Mayfair, those 6 easy words, was not a statement of love. He had not been speaking from the heart. He had been speaking from a world, from a set of arrangements and assumptions and invisible walls that had been built so long ago that no one remembered building them. He had looked at those walls and seen permanence. He had looked at his wife and seen a fixed point, something that would always be where he left it. He was not wrong about the walls. They were real. They were made of law and custom and expectation and the quiet, daily weight of a world that told women what they could and could not do. He was simply wrong about Cecilia. She had spent 8 years studying those walls. She had learned exactly where each brick was placed, exactly which ones had small cracks in them, exactly which doors had been left unlocked by accident or oversight. She had not stormed through them in a moment of anger. She had not broken anything. She had simply walked out through the gaps she had spent years quietly finding, at 3 o'clock in the morning, with a hired carriage waiting and 2 small cases already packed. The difference between fleeing and departing is everything. One is panic. The other is a plan. Cecilia Ashford Hartwell had never panicked. She had simply waited, and watched, and prepared, and then, when the moment came, she had gone. Edmund Hartwell had turned around one morning and found her gone, and in that long, quiet moment of standing in an empty room, holding a perfectly written letter, he had understood something for the first time. He had never really known her at all. He had seen a wife. He had not seen the woman. And the woman, by then, was already on a train, sitting straight-backed and still in the early morning light, watching England move past her window, breathing freely for the first time in 8 years. End.